Okay, so the recording is starting, and so you'll need to click the confirm. All right, so for the ZooTools part, hopefully you have gone through and made a copy of the Google Sheets and you already have ZooTools installed. So I recommend having the quiz part open. Again, it's not a real quiz, but it's the assignment that we're going to go through and take a look at. And it's showing you every question at the same time, so you can scroll down. There are various parts where they're just giving you instructions on how to go through things. So the first two questions I'll let you all do on your own while I go through and get things set up. But basically, as we go through this activity, we're going to go through and learn a little bit more about each other and where you come from. So the first part that I want to start talking about, and here is my personal copy of the data that we had. Yours should have some of these top parts changed to make it a little bit easier to go through and see what is what. I literally did not update it on my version of this. So when we use the term data, we're talking about information, and information can take lots of different forms. The information we have here is a mixture of numbers, it's a mixture of words, sometimes just something simple as yes or no, sometimes there's multiple options. So data is just information. The word data itself is actually plural because it's Latin, and Latin is a little weird that way. But basically what we're looking at when we're looking at information, at data, is you can often have lots of it. Organization is key here when we're going through and looking at stuff, because I could have this information in just like a giant pile, and then it would be much more difficult for me to go through and try and disentangle and learn anything from it. So again, this is the raw data that I exported from the Google form that you all filled out as part of the ZooTools one. So we have various latitudes of people's hometown, longitudes of people's hometown, latitude of your high school, longitude of your high school, the distance that you calculated between those 2 points, and how you usually went through and commuted to school. And then lastly, do you like pickles? I do not like pickles. We're evidently split 50-50, which was kind of interesting, just to throw a random question in there. But again, we're just crowdsourcing random data. So when we look at this, we have multiple pieces of data here. I've got the timestamps. I can see one who likes to work early and who waits to the last minute. Although there was definitely a variety of people adding the class late that played a role in that as well. I've got the latitude and longitudes of 2 different locations. So when you are filling out this form, use that longitude and latitude for your school for your hometown and for your school to go through and calculate a distance. Now, because we did your hometown and not necessarily your house, because I don't need to know that, that distance may not actually be how far you traveled to go to high school when you were in high school, but it is a distance between those 2 points on Earth. So we can use some data to figure out other data. So we can transform data from one type of information to another type of information. So you've got a couple of questions there that ask you about the organization of data, just in general, not necessarily of this specifically. And then also a question about what kind of data do you think is collected on your phones or online as you go about your day-to-day business. Data is becoming something that's much more prevalent in the world. Each person generates massive amounts of data over their lifetimes, more than anyone thought possible even just a few decades ago. So those questions are just for you to answer on your own. There's nothing that you need to utilize the Google Sheet to be able to answer that. So what we're going to go through and do next is we're going to first make a map of the latitude and longitudes of people's homes with the map helper in ZooTools. So I'm going to show you how to go through and do that. And then you're going to use that map to answer some following questions. So back over to my sheet. So if you've got things installed properly, if you go to add-ons, you should see ZooTools for Google Sheets. We're going to use the map helper if my computer will cooperate. All right, so we have a map that pops up. We need to select the latitude that we want to work with. We're going to do the hometown and the longitude that we want to work with. Again, I think I've shortened the titles for yours to make them easier to read, and I forgot to do it on my own. So once I select those for the appropriate latitude and longitude place, I click map. And so what it's going to do is it's essentially going to map all of those locations on there for us. So the next question in your ZooTools is essentially what's your immediate reaction to what's going on? If you go through and look at the map here, we've got 3 main places. And if we zoom in on this chunk in China, it's not just one person because we do have international students. It's actually like 5 or 6 people, or maybe it's only 4, but a handful of people all from one small area in China. So the first question is, why do you think that is? How could you possibly explain that? So can you come up with an explanation as to why we would expect a handful of students from one small region in China? That is not what I expected. So either, well, I'll stop talking and let you come up with your explanation. And then the follow-up question is, how can you tell when crowdsourced data is wrong? For example, could you go back and look at the raw data, not the map that we have, but look at the raw data of the latitude and longitudes and figure out if something is wrong? And if you did, what might you be able to do to try and fix it? Or alternatively, what could you try and do to prevent it from happening? Because we've essentially crowdsourced this data from the class. So that means if someone makes a mistake, that mistake is in the data, and we either have to identify it or it'll affect our end results. And you'll see this coming up in the Jupiter's Moons project as well, because we've crowdsourced that data. Each of you only had to measure the positions of a handful of images. And so then we're going to pool all of those resources together. So how can you tell if someone's done something wrong in your data, whether it was you or someone else, because you're essentially sharing everything with the rest of the class? All right, so your next question you can use based on the map is, where are most students from? Again, you can zoom around and move around inside the map to be able to answer that question. And the last one is, what city is the furthest person's hometown? And we'll focus on US only, so we can ignore the handful of students in China question. So again, please stop me if I'm going too fast, or if you have any questions, feel free to use the chat box. Those are just joining, we're recording, so if you don't want to have your voice heard, you can use the chat box to ask any questions. So I'll wait a minute or so before I go on to the next piece so that you can answer these questions as you're going. Yes, so the latitude and longitude that we just included on the map includes everyone's data. Just the hometown, because that's what we selected. So by selecting this particular column here, it's plotting everyone's latitude with everyone's longitude. So that's everyone that's filled out the form so far, essentially. And there definitely is people that added late last week that haven't gone through and done this. So if we were to repeat this 2 weeks from now, we would have more data to look at because more people would have filled out the form, but there's still plenty for us to work with here. And we could go through and change it if we wanted to. So right now we're looking at hometown. We could go through and do schools instead and hit map again. And I think it's updated, but everyone's schools are so close to their hometowns you couldn't even tell. Oh no, there's a handful of, now we've got some people going to school in Europe. Well, no, Middle East, Turkey, the middle of the Mediterranean. So I guess they went to schools on ships. So I think you could tell, even if you're just telling by the tone of my voice, that there were definitely some mistakes in filling out the form that were made. So in going through and looking at those questions, see if you can figure out what happened and why some of these are incorrect. I'm pretty sure I know the reason, but I want to see if you all can figure it out. Okay, I'm gonna close this map and we'll move on to the next piece. So the map is one way to visualize some of the data that we have here. I'm going to go through a few different ways so that we can see what's useful and what's not, because there's always lots of different ways to visualize data, and often it depends on the type of data that you have. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to do a scatter plot. So again, I'm going to go back to my add-ons, ZooTools, and now the scatter plot helper. If my computer wants to cooperate. Why are you not working? All right, let's try again. Oh, okay. It was starting to come up. I'll stop clicking things and let it load. Okay. So in the scatter plot helper, we need to select what we want the X variable and the Y variable for our scatter plot to be. So inside the quiz, hopefully I don't destroy things by flipping over. I've told you to use latitude as the X and longitude as the Y. Again, we're going to continue to focus on the hometown and ignore the school part for now. So latitude of the hometown, and again, I believe I've changed the names to make them easier to see for yours. So latitude for X, longitude for Y, and then I can go ahead and plot. If I hit plot, it's just going to make a little tiny plot that's going to be really hard to see down here. So that's not what I want. So I'm going to click send to sheet. And so what that's going to do, it's going to make another tab inside my Google Sheet here. And it's still sending. And it should load that scatter plot, there we go, into my tab. Now it's giving me some kind of ridiculous titling going on here. So you could go through yours again, since in your file, I believe I've changed the labels for each of those columns. So mine looks a little ridiculous because of that. But what we're seeing here, again, is latitude this direction versus longitude this direction. And you could flip it the other way if that makes more sense, which now that I think about it, flipping it actually does make more sense, since longitude corresponds to east-west. Okay. Well, we'll just talk about it as it is. So we can see from this data that there's the scatter plot, so it's a little tiny dot for each of these, and they're kind of hard to see, but over here there's a whole bunch, over here there's a whole bunch, and then we've got like one or two random ones in different places for people that live in slightly different places here. So a bunch in the 30 range, and then this one way far over. I'm not sure what's going on. So you could try and compare this to the raw data if you want. This, I think, corresponds to that chunk that was over in China, and then this, I think, corresponds to Southern California, and then we had a few that were a little bit further away in there. So you've got a couple of questions to answer about the scatter plot. So how is the scatter plot similar to and different from the map? And then what information is lost when we're looking at the data in the scatter plot? So, I mean, we're still looking at the same information that we did last time, but visualizing this in a scatter plot, we're not able to see and understand quite as much about the data as we did when we were looking at a map. But maybe if we had some other data, this would be more useful. It just depends on what your data is and what you're trying to get out of it. So I had a question that popped up. Does the amount of time taken on the assignment matter? And do we have to complete the assignment at one time, or can we come back to it? The amount of time taken on it doesn't matter. I don't think it's timed. If it is, tell me and I will change that, because it shouldn't be. And I'm not sure if you can come back to it or not. That's a good question. I'll have to go back and double check my settings. But if you have any problems, I can very easily go through and reset it for anyone that happens to need to. The putting it in as a quiz basically just allows me to grade question by question, whereas if I put it in as an assignment, I would have to go through and do everything at once. So I was hoping that would be easier on my end. But I don't think I put any sort of time limits or anything on it. So it may be showing you elapsed time, but it's not going to cut you off. I didn't put any sort of timing on it, but I'll go through when we're done and check just to make sure. Okay, so we're going to go through and make one more graph, and then I'll go through and show you a few more things to be able to finish this. So the next graph that we're going to make is a histogram. So I'll show you how to go through and do that. So I'm going to go back to my initial tab. And now we're going to do this based on distance. So I've got my F column already selected here. That's great. I'll close the ZooTools bit. So the histogram is actually not in ZooTools. It's one of the pieces that Google Sheets and Excel, if you normally use Excel, has built in. So we're going to go to Chart, and it should be popping up a bunch of options for me. But this could be an issue of my thing being slow. Oh, no, it made it. Oh, it made something. Okay. That is not what I wanted, though. All right, I'm going to reload and hope that that takes care of my particular issue. So if your computers are working appropriately, which hopefully they are, you want to go to Insert and then Charts, and then you should have a pop-up of a whole bunch of different types of charts. If you scroll down to the very bottom and mouse over one in the other section that looks like a bar chart, it should say histogram. That's the one that you're going to want. And hopefully I can get one going here. Okay, so it looks like I'm not the only one having issues with the chart popping out. It definitely worked last night when I was testing everything. Okay, let's try this again. So So I want to make sure that I have the F column selected. Okay, I'm going to try just clicking that, and maybe I can change it after the fact. Okay, so we'll go, here we go. Change chart type, scroll all the way down, and then histogram. That's the one we wanted. And if you don't like this being all on top of your raw data, you can move it over so that you can have it in a place where there's not other stuff going on. Okay. So I'm going to very quickly, I want to go back to editing the chart. I'm going to edit some of these axes. So the horizontal part is distance in kilometers. And then my vertical axis is number of people. I'm just going to get rid of my chart title because that's irritating me. Okay, so now we have a histogram. So a histogram basically collects data into bins or groups. So it's kind of like if you had a bunch of different buckets and you were sorting stuff into those different buckets. So each one of these bars represents one of those buckets. So in this particular bucket, we have the number of people who live somewhere between 0 and 2,100 kilometers away from school, which is going to be almost everyone. And then we have a handful of these over here, which if you go back and look at the raw data for distances, is likely due to entering something in incorrectly somewhere. Because I don't think anyone lives 4,000 kilometers away from the high school that they attended. So I'm going to guess that that is due to errors. So we could even go back through, if we wanted to, you can play around with this a little bit and delete those extra large numbers, the ones that are larger than 4,000, and you could go through and repeat this. In fact, if I go through and do that right now, over to my, so here's one. If Google's smart enough, it says there's another 4,000 something. I don't see another big one, I just see those. Okay. It says there's a 5,000 still waiting around. Oh, it's this bottom one. Okay. So now if I take those away, it auto redistributes the leftover bits. So now instead of having it go from 0 to 2,000, it's going 0 to 27 here. And so each one of these is an equal distance. So this is 27 kilometers, this is 27 more kilometers, that's 27 more kilometers. So again, we can see most people live relatively close to where they went to high school, which is not terribly surprising. So you have a few questions to go through and answer for this particular histogram graph as well, where you'll see what you can tell by looking at it. You'll go through and compare it to the map and see what sort of concepts are easier to grasp. The last thing that I want to go through and talk to you about is some basic statistics before we run out of time here. And so I deleted some of that data. I need to put it back so that we can talk about the statistics. So there are a handful of statistics that we'll use in going through and doing this class. And so I'm going to go through and show them to you. I'm going to do it for the latitude of your hometown. And in order to finish the assignment, you will repeat this for distance. So feel free to go along with me. I always like to put text labels so I know what it is that I made afterwards. So min is just the minimum of all of the things in your category. So you can scroll up and actually just drag and select everything in that column if you want. And so you can see it's equals, min, parentheses, and then you have the range of what you've got going on. And then just make sure you close parentheses in there. And so now that's picked up whatever the minimum number in this whole column is. The other way you can do it, which I'll show you for max, is going to pick up the biggest number in this column, is if you already know what your range is. So we're in column B, and my first item is in row 2, and it's going to go all the way to B, and then row 30. So you can see that selected that same spot of numbers. So if I hit enter now my maximum value in here is 117. That one actually is probably real. Oh, no, I think someone flipped their numbers there. Okay, and then so the next one is average. Sometimes this is called the mean of the data, but most people think about it in terms of average. Same thing. And actually, it doesn't matter whether your letters are capital or not. It still understands, because I do a mix often. So the average is 37. Which is not too far off from where we are, which is about 34 latitude. And this last one you may not be as familiar with. So standard deviation is a way of looking at how much of a spread you have. Let me go ahead and calculate it first. And this is also how a lot of teachers go through and do a scaling of your grades, actually. So basically what this is saying is that if the average is 37, that most people are within 15 of that 37. And so for every standard deviation further away, you'll have a little bit more. So essentially that if I were to look at a plot of this, sometimes you'll see those curves. But what this is essentially telling you is that, let's see, like something like 70% of the people are going to have latitude somewhere between let's see, 17 and 52 degrees latitude. And then if we do 30 on 30, just doubling this, so 2 standard deviations, that would mean that we would have something like close to 90% would be living somewhere between 7 degrees latitude and 67 degrees latitude. So the further out, the more standard deviations out you go, the closer to 100% you get. But each of the standard deviations corresponds to a specific percentage. So it's a way to see how spread out our data happens to be. So if this number is really small, then that means most of the numbers are really, really close to your average. If that number is very big, it means your numbers are very, very spread out. So you'll go through and repeat this for the distance column to go through and take a look at that. The final questions that you have on here are correspond to just general ones. So this is where you'll go through and do the same thing for the distance column. And then there's a little bit of math at the very end. So you can go through and just Google the circumference of the Earth in kilometers. And you'll do a little bit of math for this question and the next one to sort of see how these distances compare to each other. So you can take a look at how far we generally travel, for example, compared to, say, the circumference of the Earth, and things like that. So that is everything for the ZooTools. So once you go through and do that, enter those questions, submit, you're done with that part of this lab.